Good morning. I am Katrina Lantos Swett, and along with my sister Annette and my mother Annette, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2011 Lantos Human Rights Prize Award ceremony. Many years ago, when I was a young, newly minted lawyer working on Capitol Hill for then Senator Joe Biden, I was being romantically pursued by another Hill staffer. This young man, who shall remain nameless, had the most thought-provoking pickup line that I was ever on the receiving end of. And although I never actually went out on a date with him, I also never forgot his question. It went something like this: if tonight, as you prepare to go to bed, the light in your room grows brighter and brighter, and you find yourself miraculously in the presence of God, and he tells you, I will answer any single question for you, what would you ask? I thought long and hard about how I would use such a precious opportunity. I didn't want to ask a question that I probably already knew the answer to. For example, what is the greatest thing in life? I think deep down we all know it's love. Or how can we achieve peace and reconciliation? Once again, I think we know the answer: forgiveness, respect, mutual understanding. In the end, I decided I would ask God a very personal question, because I believe that to the extent he works in this world, it is most often through us. And so the question that I determined I would ask was, what will be the greatest moral challenge I will face in my life, and will I be equal to it? Will I meet it in a way that makes you proud? Our honoree this year, Mr. Paul Rusesabagina, has answered that question and has done so resoundingly in the affirmative. World-renowned author, Nobel laureate, and last year's recipient of the Lantos Prize, Professor Elie Wiesel, has written that wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. 17 years ago, when Rwanda desperately needed to be the center of the universe, the world instead turned away. As a genocidal assault was unleashed on the Tutsi people, the community of nations, to their everlasting shame, stood by and did nothing. And as a consequence, nearly 1 million Rwandans were massacred in just 100 days. But while the mighty and powerful found reasons and excuses to turn away, Paul Rusesabagina, a self-described ordinary man, did not turn away. Paul's brave and profoundly decent actions as the manager of the Hotel des Mille Collines helped save the lives of over 1,200 Tutsis and moderate Hutus who had taken refuge in his hotel. What is remarkable about Paul Rusesabagina's achievement is that it was not the result of a grandiose plan to thwart the evil that was raging outside the gates of his hotel. No, not at all. Paul would be the first to say that minute to minute, day to day, making it up as he went along, he was simply determined to do one more thing, to try and save lives for one more day. Where did he find the strength and humanity to do this, to live out the idea that he was indeed his brothers' and sisters' keeper? I don't know, but I do know that we can perhaps hope to find similar strength and humanity from following his example. Paul's story is one that particularly resonates with my family because it reminds us of the heroic rescue mission of the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust, including my father, Tom Lantos. In 2012, we will celebrate the centennial of Raoul Wallenberg's birth, and it is fitting indeed that Paul has previously been awarded the Wallenberg Medal for his outstanding humanitarian actions on behalf of the defenseless. I spoke earlier of wanting to inquire of God what might be the great moral test of my life. Paul met his great test, and he would have been more than justified in seeking a life of quiet and peace in which he could be recognized for his good works, but also left alone to enjoy the simple, ordinary pleasures of family and friends. Perhaps it is not surprising that Paul instead chose the path less traveled and more fraught with risk. While recognizing the significant progress that has been made in Rwanda under President Kagame, Paul has nonetheless dared to speak out against the serious challenges to democracy and human rights that exist in Rwanda today. His call for a truth and reconciliation process is the right prescription for a country that still faces deep-rooted tensions that, if not addressed, could pose a serious risk to the people of this region who have already suffered so much. Sadly, Paul's willingness to publicly confront these issues has made him the target of bitter attacks on his character and motives. Unfortunately, these attacks appear to be consistent with a disturbing pattern of censorship, intimidation, and even violence that has been directed against those who have dared voice concerns about the government of Rwanda. This pattern is not unique to Rwanda. As Mark Twain observed, history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Raoul Wallenberg was arrested and sent to the Soviet Gulag for his heroic deeds during the Holocaust. In our own country, Martin Luther King Jr., who was hailed in America when he became the youngest Nobel laureate, became the subject of bitter denunciation when he dared speak out against our involvement in the Vietnam War. And last year's recipient of the Nobel Prize, the Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, languishes in a Chinese prison for daring to write about a democratic future for his country. I suppose we could say that Paul is in good company. And as he told me just a few weeks ago, I am not threatened, and I will not be silent. As Charlie Clements, the director of the Harvard Carr Center for Human Rights, said recently, it has never been Paul Rusesabagina's nature to stay in his place. He would not have saved lives at the hotel had he stayed in his role as mere hotel manager. We are so proud at the Lantos Foundation to be adding our recognition to the many others that Paul has rightly received. This extraordinary man never wielded a gun, never swung a machete, but he used his words and his humanity to find a small path in the darkness and helped hundreds of his fellow human beings follow that path to safety. Paul Rusesabagina has set a path for us to follow as well. Thank you. As a point of personal privilege, something I know members of Congress like to do often, and we did have to excuse our two distinguished members because they had other pressing congressional duties. But before I introduce our very distinguished guest who will be introducing Paul, I would like to take a moment to recognize Tasi Rusesabagina. I know from my family's experience that in my father's very courageous life as a human rights hero, it was my mother who was not only his inspiration and his strength, but sometimes that desperately needed prick that compelled him to do the right thing when it was uncomfortable, when it was hard, when it was difficult. And Tasi Rusesabagina was that in so many ways in her husband's life. And so I would like to ask you to join me in paying tribute to Tasi Rusesabagina. It is now my responsibility to introduce Bob Krueger. Bob Krueger has had a truly remarkable career, and I debated whether I should refer to him as Professor Krueger, Congressman Krueger, Senator Krueger, or Ambassador Krueger. In the end, and I hope with your permission, I decided just to stick with Bob. Born in the small town of New Braunfels, Texas, Bob Krueger was educated in the local public school system, graduated cum laude with honors Phi Beta Kappa from Southern Methodist University, and went on to get a master's and a PhD at many distinguished institutions. In 1961, at the very tender age of 25, he began teaching at Duke University and quickly rose to become Duke's vice provost and dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. In 1974, he won a seat in Congress representing, bear with me, it took me a little while to wrap my mind around this, representing the 50,000 square mile 21st District of Texas. Now, my husband, Dick Swett, had the opportunity to represent New Hampshire in Congress for a couple of years, and New Hampshire in its entirety is about 9,000 square miles, so we had a little more than half of that. So that's a daunting piece of turf to have to represent. You know, he quickly came to the attention of so many, and at that time, the New York Times, in a very admiring profile, said, "Men and women who have been around Congress for years say they cannot remember another freshman House member gaining such stature in such a short time." After narrowly losing an election to the Senate in 1978, Bob was appointed Ambassador at Large for Mexican Affairs by President Carter. This was to be just the first of several ambassadorial assignments that he fulfilled. He served briefly in the United States Senate, where he completed the term of Lloyd Benson when Benson became the Assistant Secretary, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury. Following that, Bob was appointed by President Clinton to be the ambassador to Burundi. It is not hyperbole, it is a simple statement of fact that Bob Krueger was the best ambassador ever to serve in Burundi, and one of the finest ambassadors we have ever had, period. Why is this? It was because of his courageous and outspoken defense of human rights. His outspokenness put Bob directly in the line of fire. 2 Burundi newspapers called for his assassination on their front pages, and in fact, he was the target of an ambush which killed 2 people and seriously wounded 8 others. Thankfully, Bob survived that attack uninjured. You read the words of Burundi leaders about Bob, and it really makes you feel proud to have had an ambassador such as this serving our country. The foreign minister has said, "Robert Krueger is certainly the most influential and best ambassador ever to serve in Burundi. He saved many lives and gave hope to those who lost their cherished ones." And a member of the Burundian parliament has said, "An ambassador out of the ordinary. He would go to the countryside to see for himself the atrocities committed against a population that left many too afraid to speak out. He risked his own life in an ambush planned by those who feared his outspokenness. This man of peace and exceptional courage has contributed immensely to the defense of human rights for the population of Burundi." Bob went on to serve as ambassador to Botswana and as U.S. Special Representative to the Southern African Development Community. In recent years, he has continued his academic career, become an author, and is incredibly active in public service in his home state of Texas. An outstanding individual of great intellectual depth and an even greater depth of compassion and tenderheartedness for his fellow human beings, I was particularly touched to learn that Bob still lives in the same house he moved to as a 7-year-old boy on the banks of the Guadalupe River in New Braunfels, Texas. Please join me in welcoming Professor, Congressman, Senator, and Ambassador Bob Krueger.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to have a searchlight across the mountaintops. There are lots of valleys in between that didn't get included in that, but we all know they're there. I'm honored today to introduce a close friend, Paul Rusesabagina, recipient of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Award. I didn't know personally Congressman Tom Lantos. I was here before him and never got got to know him personally, but I certainly saw him often on television. And what struck me then and strikes me now as I speak of a good friend receiving the award bearing his name is, this was a man who sailed upstream and was consistently willing against prevailing public opinion, whether it was within his own party or in the other party or wherever it came from. He was consistently there in defense of human rights. Human rights overrode any partisanship, any particular position, overrode personal popularity because he was convinced of what should be done. And I think there's some very clear parallels, obviously, between Tom Lantos and Paul Rusesabagina. They both came from small nations. They both were nations that were wrecked with violence. They both were in circumstances in which their own lives were in peril. They both were able to escape to the United States of America. And they both cared about human rights and other people. And they cared about it when others didn't pay any attention. And they did so at great personal risk. I was next door to Rwanda in Burundi during the time that the genocide was proceeding there. And we were having a lesser genocide in Burundi. I realized quickly when I got to Burundi, and both of these are countries right in Central Africa, twin countries, have the same ethnic makeup, virtually the same population. They're the size of Maryland, one with 6, the other with 7 million people at that time. Both have Hutu and Tutsi, both have about the same percentages, both have a long history of cruelty and governments that have gone awry. In my country, Burundi, at least 100 people a day were being killed, I knew, in genocidal attacks when I was there. 100 may not sound that many, but if you look at the difference in population, it's like 4,200 a day being killed in the USA, which would amount to, if you didn't consider property damage, would amount to 10 Twin Tower attacks every week in Burundi. And nobody cared. I remember phoning someone with a major news service and telling him that I thought I could take him, if he wished, to an area that had some 200 people killed. He said, oh, you know, American public's kind of tired of seeing those bodies floating down the river. They don't have any interest in that. He wasn't going to fly over from Kenya. It was just 200 people that had been killed. Didn't seem to matter. In Rwanda, meanwhile, 800,000 people in a country of 7 million were killed in roughly 100 days' time. That's comparable to 40 million Americans being killed in 100 days' time. And the world didn't seem to care. But Tom Lantos cared. And Paul Rusesabagina cared. And they did what they could in those circumstances. In Paul's case, it was a case of going day by day, issue by issue, second after second, minute after minute, having to use his own resourcefulness, his cleverness, his whiskey, his cigars, whatever he could to keep people alive just a little bit longer. And he kept doing it day after day after day after day, so that, as the movie has so dramatically shown, in truth, he saved 1,268 lives. It was interesting for me to hear various people refer to an island, because one of the things that occurred to me as I was thinking about Paul and about this introduction was that Paul did indeed provide a kind of island of safety in the midst of a storm of conflict that was going on all around him. Had neither a gun, nor a sword, nor a shield, nor a fortress of any kind. Had only his own resources to try to use to protect these people. And I thought of the song that was, I think, a Joan Baez ballad and done by others. No man is an island, no man stands alone. And it goes on to say, each man is my brother, each man is my friend. And when I thought of that song, I thought of what Paul did. And of course, the phrase, no man is an island, comes, Joan Baez didn't invent it, a man named John Donne wrote it in his 15th meditation in 1603. He was a poet and preacher in England, and he said, no man is an island of itself. Each man is a part of the continent, a part of the main. If a promontory in Europe is washed into the sea, I am diminished thereby, for I am involved in mankind. And then he said, therefore never ask to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Paul Rusesabagina and Tom Lantos heard that bell tolling. It was a bell that called them to recognize that really Earth is just a tiny little planet in an infinite universe. And somehow, nonetheless, each person is diminished if one is diminished thereby. It's a bell that called people to be drawn together, possibly joined in one overriding purpose. It reminded us that poor nations like Hungary and Rwanda can produce people rich in character, rich in courage, rich in humanity, rich in their service to others. I am therefore honored today to introduce to you a person who has already been eloquently introduced, and most of all, by his own example. Each man is our brother, our friend, our brother, Paul Rusesabagina.